Hello guys and welcome back. If you are new around here, I cover mostly Australian cases and today we're going to be discussing the solved case of Ursula Barwick, who went missing back in 1987 and was not seen again for another 30 years. And just a reminder, if you want to keep up to date with what's happening in between uploads, to follow me over on my social media, just search Samantha Melanie or I'll pop the username on the screen for you now. And I just want to say a super quick thank you to all of you for your support in 2019. I think I started this year with like 1,000 subscribers. I don't even remember. And now we're at 42k or something like that, which is incredible. I have no idea when this video is going to go up, but I'm going to say anyway, Happy New Year, Happy 2020, and I'm super excited to see what this year holds for all of us. So let's get into today's case. So we're heading back to 1987 to the small country town of Quirindi, New South Wales, which by the way has a population of just 2,500 people, just to give you an idea of how small we're talking here. There lived a bubbly, blonde-haired, blue-eyed 17-year-old named Ursula Barwick. And Ursula was a real country girl. She loved animals and the outdoors and was described by friends and family as confident and always having a smile on her face. But despite her joyous personality, Ursula had been through quite a lot in her short 17 years. She had lost not one but two siblings. In 1972, Ursula lost her little brother Christopher just a few days before he was born. And a few years later, in 1976, when Ursula was around 6 or 7 years old, she lost her older brother Lee Andrew, who sadly passed away due to a rare health condition at just 8 years old. Her parents, Peter and Cherie, separated and eventually divorced when Ursula was in primary school, but they did remain on good terms. And her father did go on to remarry a woman named Elizabeth Turner in 1978, which was a few years after the divorce was finalised. Peter and Elizabeth eventually moved out of Quirindi and to the central coast of Australia, which according to Google is about a 3-hour car journey, so a fair distance from Ursula. The marriage also produced two younger siblings for Ursula, Andrew and Kate, and she absolutely adored her younger siblings, and they felt the same way about her as well. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about Andrew later on, as he eventually becomes a key player in this investigation. So it was quite evident early on that Ursula had a very special way with babies and children. Aside from her adoring siblings, she also had a lot of younger cousins who thought the world of her. Which leads me to telling you about the work experience that Ursula did in year 10, unsurprisingly as a nanny. The work experience actually took place in Sydney, which is a good few hours from Quirindi, and this work experience was Ursula's first taste of big city life, which I'm sure you can imagine was a very exciting experience for a young teenage girl. And as it turned out, Ursula loved Sydney, and she decided that one day she would return to live there. And just a few short years later, she would follow through with this plan. So let's talk about Ursula's teenage years. She was a pretty typical rebellious teen who fought with her mum, whom she lived with pretty frequently, and went through a bit of a party phase during those later teenage years, as so many of us do. She was drinking, experimenting with drugs, and having fun with boys. Her mother eventually became sick of her daughter's behaviour, however, and sent her to live with her father and stepmother when she was around 16. But it was not long before Ursula and her father were butting heads, just as she had been with her mother. An example of one frustrating thing that Ursula did during her stay with her father was when she made a trip to Sydney, telling him she would only be gone for the day, but ended up being gone for multiple days. Her father was worried sick, of course, and she was reported missing to the police. But as she always did, Ursula eventually turned up. After one too many disagreements, Ursula, who was now 17, told her father, "Well, I'm 17 now, I can leave home." So she did. She made plans to move to Sydney, and she told her family she had a job lined up at a bohemian jewellery and clothing store in Hornsby. And her father, who did not want to put any more strain on their relationship, supported his daughter's decision to move to Sydney. So it was late September 1987, around midweek, when Ursula's father drove her to the train station in Tuggerah, near where he lived, and she boarded the 2-hour train ride to Sydney. Peter gave his daughter, who he described as being in a joyful mood, some cash to help her get settled into her new living situation before the pair departed. However, he did expect to see his daughter in about a week or two, as Ursula had told him that once she was settled in, she'd give him a call and let him and Elizabeth know when they could visit and bring the remainder of her possessions. But that call never came. As I mentioned to you a moment ago, Ursula had disappeared in the past without contacting her family. So the panic, from what I can gather at least, was not immediate. But a few weeks passed, and her family and friends still had not heard a word from Ursula. They became incredibly worried, as she was a young and trusting girl from country Australia that had never really experienced the big city life. Her mother even tried contacting the family that Ursula had nannied for a few years earlier, but they hadn't heard anything. So it was definitely the thought amongst friends and family that maybe Ursula was trying to spread her wings, enjoy her new, exciting big city life, be independent, or as teenagers do, rebel. But still, she had never gone missing for more than a few days at a time. Her family eventually made the decision to report Ursula missing to the Sydney police, with her father driving down to Sydney to make the report in person and give them a detailed description of his daughter. But that report has since been lost, so we don't know exactly what was said. Ursula's friends and family really held out hope for her return, right up until Christmas Day, as they thought for sure, even if Ursula decided to fly under the radar for a couple of months, she'd return to see everyone over the holidays. However, Christmas came and went with no sign of Ursula. But what they did not know at this time was that Ursula had been found. Her friends and family, however, would not find her for another 30 years. As time passed and no new information was showing up from the police investigation, Ursula's father decided to take matters into his own hands. He headed to Sydney to carry out his own search for Ursula, beginning in King's Cross, as police had received reports she'd been spotted in the area, and as he searched brothel to brothel, he carried his daughter's photo wherever he went. Years later, he would find out that Ursula had indeed been in King's Cross after her arrival in Sydney. And by the way, for all my non-locals, if you are unfamiliar with Sydney's King's Cross, it's an area full of, or at least used to be full of, pubs, bars, nightclubs and brothels. And at one point, a lot of crime and corruption. It was considered Sydney's red light district at one stage, and nicknamed the Golden Mile. I'm not from Sydney myself, and I don't personally know what it's like today, although I'm led to believe that Sydney's lockout laws pretty much killed its nightlife. But if you are a Sydney local, you'll have to let me know in the comments below what King's Cross is like in 2019. So Peter Barwick really got a good look at the dark side of the cross, as it is often referred to, while looking for Ursula, and by the sounds of it, it was an experience that was a bit of an eye-opener for him, as I think it would be for many of us if we had had a chance to see or visit King's Cross during the late 80s. I actually did a bit of research on King's Cross when I was researching this video, and it's really interesting. I barely skimmed the surface, but just Google King's Cross and have a look at the history of the cross. It's incredibly interesting, actually. Weeks, months, and years passed, and during this time, Ursula's family kept hope, as they could just not believe that Ursula would choose to disappear. But thinking of the alternatives of what may have happened to her was too much to bear. And it was even believed by some that Ursula may have been a very early victim of serial killer Ivan Milat, or the backpacker killer, whom I have done a video on here on YouTube if you are unfamiliar with that case and have no idea what I'm talking about. Despite the fact the police were apparently investigating the case, none of Ursula's friends and family were ever formally interviewed about her disappearance. So I would say it's pretty clear that there was a lack of interest from police in solving her case, at least at that time. And they likely considered Ursula a young teenage runaway, and because she was last seen in King's Cross, they possibly believed she had chosen a different lifestyle, one that she didn't want her friends and family to become aware of. Over the years, her father buried himself in work, eventually being prescribed antidepressants, and it was around the 10-year mark since his daughter's disappearance that Peter began to accept that Ursula was most likely not alive. And at the 17-year mark in 2004, her mother Cherie was diagnosed with bone cancer, and she eventually passed away, never knowing what actually happened to her only daughter. And Cherie said before she passed away that she had finally accepted that Ursula was no longer alive, and she believed that she was about to meet her missing daughter. So I mentioned to you at the beginning that Ursula had a younger brother, Andrew, and Andrew actually became a police officer, partly in the hope that he would be able to solve his sister's disappearance. And one day at work, Andrew told a work colleague, Senior Constable Adam Marsh, who had been temporarily transferred to the missing persons unit, about his missing sister. Adam told Andrew he would have a look around, and he did. And in fact, what Adam did find could have and would have solved this case, except his work colleagues told him it wasn't worth pursuing, so he stopped. And he never told Andrew or the Barwick family exactly what he found until years later. In 2010, Ursula became part of a missing persons campaign run by the Australian Federal Police, and as part of this campaign, age progression technology was used to show what multiple long-term missing persons would look like in the present day. So images of Ursula and other missing persons were put up across airports and on television, but unfortunately nothing resulted from this for Ursula's family. But Ursula's cousin, Melissa Pulio, who had been around 14 or 15 when Ursula went missing, noted that her age progression photo, meant to show Ursula around the age of 40, was inaccurate. And this was also picked up by several other family members. Her eye colour and hair colour were off, not to mention the date stated in which she went missing was off by weeks. And as a result of this, Melissa reached out to the police to have the mistakes corrected, but they never were, as Melissa was told the details could not be changed unless this case was reopened. Following this, a very frustrated Melissa began making her own inquiries, getting in contact with some of Ursula's old friends on Facebook, and putting together a spreadsheet of information about the case for police, should this case ever be reopened. And Melissa Donnelly, who was one of the school friends that cousin Melissa got into contact with, was actually able to provide her with some pretty vital information. And sorry to confuse you with the two Melissas there. But anyway, this information was some letters that Ursula had sent to her friend just before she left for Sydney. And the tone of these letters was very much, love you, miss you, see you soon, giving the impression that Ursula had no intention of running away for an extended period. These letters had a cute little cartoon in them of a beak wearing a little hat hand-drawn by Ursula that said, "Hi girls, see you soon and miss you all heaps XX." So these letters were dated on September 6, 1987, and Ursula's missing persons poster said that she had not been seen since August 14, which was in fact actually Ursula's birthday, further confirming that the date on the missing person poster was off by quite a bit. Ursula's friend Melissa said that the reason that she'd held on to these letters for all of these years was because she thought that police would eventually need or want to collect them for evidence, but they never did. And cousin Melissa also found another friend of Ursula's named Angelique, who said she'd seen Ursula in King's Cross after her arrival in Sydney in late September, and had even said hello to her, meaning that Ursula had at least made it off the train and into Sydney before she disappeared. Now let's fast forward to 2014, where there was a bit of a renewed interest in Ursula's case, thanks to a statewide push to solve stagnant missing persons cases in New South Wales, and subsequently, detectives Kurt Haywood and Amy Scott were assigned Ursula's case. After what had been almost 30 years since her disappearance, friends and family of Ursula's were formally interviewed. The detectives assigned to the case initially thought they were dealing with a homicide investigation, because at a glance, that's exactly what this looks like. A young girl, possibly quite naive, new to the big city goes missing, never to be seen again. Surely something sinister must have happened to her. I don't know about you, but that would have been my best guess. But after looking more closely at the details of Ursula's case, the detectives felt as though they were dealing with something else, something more. And that brings us to the following year, 2015, when Ursula Barwick became the face of Missing Persons Week. And during this time, a call did come into Crime Stoppers that sounded promising from someone that claimed Ursula was working at the Coach and Horse Hotel in Randwick, Sydney, back in July of 1989. But unfortunately, this turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. Although Missing Persons Week didn't bring up any new tips about Ursula, it did manage to trigger a very important memory for Senior Constable Adam Marsh, whom I mentioned to you before as being Ursula's brother's work colleague. Senior Constable Marsh, who several years earlier had been advised to disregard a potential lead in Ursula's case, saw a different photo of Ursula during Missing Persons Week to what he had previously seen, and knew for sure that he had seen that girl before, but somewhere else. You see, when he had initially been looking into Ursula's case, he very cleverly, if you ask me, was comparing long-term missing persons cases with unidentified remains, and one of those unidentified remains was a girl named Jessica Pierce, a car crash victim who bore a striking resemblance to Ursula. Jessica, who had been identified by a mystery friend, had lay in a morgue in Sydney back in 1987 for over a year, unclaimed by anyone, before being buried. And when Senior Constable Marsh tried to bring up any information on who Jessica Pierce was, nothing came up, as though she had never existed. But still, his colleagues at the time told him to forget it. However, when Senior Constable Marsh saw a different photo of Ursula, he was certain that she and Jessica Pierce were one and the same. Senior Constable Marsh, who was no longer working in the Missing Persons Unit at this point, passed this information on to detectives working on Ursula's case, Haywood and Scott, who took the photos of car crash victim Jessica Pierce and showed them to Peter and Elizabeth Barwick in the hopes they may be able to identify Ursula from the photos. And the photos they had to view were not only of the gruesome car crash scene images, but photos taken in the morgue. And as you can imagine, it was a harrowing experience for the Barwick family. After viewing the photos, Peter and Elizabeth were certain it was their Ursula. And in this moment, any hope of the Barwicks finding Ursula alive came crashing down. They did, however, finally have some closure, and an inquest later confirmed that Jessica Pierce was indeed Ursula Barwick. So with the positive identification of Ursula came a heck of a lot of questions as to how and why this case was not solved sooner. You may be thinking, how is it possible that the Missing Persons Unit does not cross-check with unidentified remains, particularly ones that have been left unclaimed for extended periods of time? That was certainly my first thought in this case. And another question that may be on your mind: exactly what happened to Ursula during her last days alive? Well, since they finally knew that Jessica and Ursula were one and the same, investigators were able to go back and talk to those involved in her last days and piece together Ursula's final movements. Now we're going to go right back to where our story started, when Ursula arrived in Sydney back in late September of 1987. And as it turned out, she actually did not have much of a plan for what she was going to do or where she was going to live. And it's also not believed that she had a job lined up like she told her parents. It seems like Ursula spent most of her time in Sydney hanging out in King's Cross with a group of street kids that she had befriended and playing pool, hence why witnesses later recalled seeing Ursula hanging out in King's Cross. One of these kids that Ursula had been hanging out with described her as a sweet girl and very innocent compared with us, a real country bumpkin. So it seems that despite her name change from Ursula to Jess, it was pretty obvious to those around her that she was not a Sydney local. And it's still really unknown why Ursula did change her name. Perhaps she thought her name wasn't cool or trendy, like the name Jessica had been in the late 80s. The only thing we really do know is why she chose the name Jessica. And that's because Jess was the name that she had liked and thought that she may call her future daughter. But instead, it became Ursula's name for the next 30 years. During her time in Sydney, Ursula met a man named Mark, who was from Melbourne, and the pair began dating. And I don't think a whole lot is known about their relationship, as they had only met in the time Ursula had been in Sydney, which was mere weeks at that point. But we do know that they referred to each other as boyfriend and girlfriend. So on October 27, 1987, Mark and Ursula set off on a trip to Melbourne with two other friends, Hans and Robert. The vehicle in which the group would be travelling in was actually stolen by Hans, and it's believed Ursula was aware of this, but regardless, they all set off that evening, with Hans driving the first leg of the journey. They got as far as the town of Yass before Hans handed the car over to Robert, and Hans had given Robert some very specific instructions. He explicitly told Robert, "Do not put this car into cruise control." It wasn't long before the group headed off again, with Ursula, or Jess, asleep in the back seat, with her boyfriend Mark, Hans in the passenger seat, and Robert driving. And of course, what does he do? He puts the car into cruise control at 120 k's or 75 miles per hour, full speed down the Hume Highway. And in the early hours of the morning, Robert fell asleep at the wheel. And with the car still doing 120 k's in cruise control, the stolen vehicle collided with a semi-trailer going full speed. And it should be noted that Hans and Robert were wearing seatbelts, but it is thought that because Ursula and Mark were lying down, sleeping in the back seat, that they may not have been wearing theirs. And as a result of the crash, Mark became a paraplegic. Hans and Robert went to jail, Hans for theft and Robert for reckless driving, resulting in death, and Ursula Barwick died at the scene. Ursula's body was taken to the Glebe Sydney morgue, and after 5 months, a supposed friend identified her as Jessica Pearce and gave additional details that later all turned out to be false. And this person also said that she had known Jessica for 3.5 years, which we now know does not add up, as Jessica had only existed for a matter of weeks. And this friend has also never been seen or heard from again. Jessica/Ursula also had no ID or bank cards on her, and of course no mobile phones, being that it was the late 80s, so there was absolutely nothing to be able to positively identify this mystery girl at the time. And her age guesstimation by the police probably didn't help this investigation either, as they believed her to be around 25 years old, even though the people in the car told them that they thought Jess was closer to 17. Ursula's body lay unclaimed in the morgue for 15 months before she was eventually buried at Emu Plain Cemetery in an unmarked pauper's grave. And to this day, it's still not known exactly where Ursula is buried in the cemetery, because back in 1987, records were not exactly being kept properly, which is why we don't know, and may never know for sure, where her final resting place is. During the 15 months that she lay in the morgue, although Jessica's description almost perfectly matched missing person Ursula Barwick, it seems as though the two departments simply didn't cross-check or communicate with each other, which makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. So I found a quote regarding the issue from journalist Ava Benny Morrison, who stated, "You've got the New South Wales Health that looks after the morgue, then you've got the New South Wales Police who are in charge of the investigation. They all have different records and databases and systems that are not talking with each other. When you have an unidentified body turn up, it's not automatically matching against a missing persons report." And I'm sure you'll all agree with me here that this oversight highlights a massive problem within the system. I mean, how many missing persons cases remain unsolved because two departments are not working together and are not cross-checking with each other? But the good news is that Ursula's case has inspired a push for change in the New South Wales Police Force. The police say they're actually currently reviewing and developing a new standard operating procedures, which hopefully means that we may see a rise in missing persons cases solved in the next few years as forensics evolve and unidentified and unclaimed remains are matched with missing persons reports. In July of 2017, Ursula's friends and family finally had the chance to hold a memorial service for her and say a proper goodbye in the cemetery in which she's buried. Over 50 people showed up for the service, and her father actually made a comment that really stuck out to me. He said that he had somehow expected her friends from 30 years ago to still be 17 years old, just as Ursula still was in his memory. But they were all in their 40s, some married, some had children, all things Ursula would never have the chance to do. And that pretty much wraps up our case today. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for listening to Ursula's story. And thank you for being here for however long you've been here, whether that's been from the beginning, for the whole year, for the last day, whether you have found me today. Thank you. Like, comment, subscribe. Let me know down below what you thought of this insane case. I have memberships now as well if you're interested, and we have a bean. Her name is Lola. So many of you ask. Oh, that can't be comfortable. I haven't seen her in a video for so long. Hi. Hi. Hello. So many of you comment on my cat in every video, and it's so sweet. Hello. Have you missed being in my videos? Hi. Thank you guys for being here. We better go. I will see you guys next time. Stay vigilant, stay safe. Isn't that right? Stay vigilant and safe. We will see you soon. Bye, guys. You say bye? You say bye? Nah.